They say a man's home is his castle, but I never thought mine would become the site of a suburban rebellion. It all started with a flamingo. Yes, a plastic flamingo, bright pink, a little goofy, and completely harmless. I stuck it in my front yard because it made me smile. A simple act of color in a neighborhood draped in beige, gray, and the ever-depressing, approved earth tones. That was all it took to stir the wrath of Karen. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the self-appointed monarch of our homeowners association, a walking, talking enforcement manual with a bob haircut and a clipboard permanently fused to her hand. Her gaze could strip paint from a mailbox, and her smile had the warmth of a parking ticket. She lived 3 houses down, in a pristine white colonial, with shutters so symmetrical you'd think they were laser-aligned. Karen believed in order, in monotony, in crushing anything that resembled spontaneous joy. And according to her, my yard had committed the cardinal sin of excessive cheerfulness. At first I thought she was joking. When she walked over, heels clicking on my driveway like an approaching sentence, and said, "Your yard is a bit much," I laughed. I thought she meant it endearingly. But then she gave the flamingo a look, as if it had personally insulted her pedigree, and I realized she was dead serious. That flamingo, alongside my rainbow pinwheels, fairy lights, and smiling gnome army, had become a symbol of everything Karen stood against. My yard wasn't just too bright, it was, in her words, an emotional disruption. A disruption to what, I wondered? To the sacred harmony of beige mulch and tightly trimmed boxwoods, to the somber march of dullness that passed for aesthetic in our HOA rulebook. Still, I tried to be neighborly. I trimmed things, toned down the lights, even moved the flamingo behind a hydrangea. But it wasn't enough. Not for Karen. The second complaint came in a week later, then another, and another, each more absurd than the last. That's when I realized this wasn't about yard decor. It was about control. Karen didn't want a peaceful neighborhood. She wanted a quiet kingdom. And I was the jester who dared to juggle in her court. I hadn't planned on becoming a troublemaker. But if joy was a crime here, maybe it was time to break some rules, with a little bounce. The letter came folded neatly in a white HOA envelope, slid under my door like a declaration of war. Violation notice, it read in bold uppercase letters at the top. My offense: use of unapproved decorative elements resulting in excessive yard cheerfulness. I stared at the page, half expecting it to burst into confetti. Was I being punked? I read it again. Nope. Dead serious. Apparently, my newly added sunflower wind spinner and the gnome holding a "Have a Magical Day" sign had triggered a formal complaint. At first, I chuckled. I mean, who complains about cheerfulness? But my amusement quickly faded when I saw the signature at the bottom, Karen J. Whitmore, HOA board member. I could practically hear her voice through the paper, clipped, nasal, precise. She hadn't just filed the complaint. She had authored the entire notice herself, citing subsections of the community guidelines like scripture. She even included a blurry photo of my yard, as if catching it in the act. The next morning, Karen appeared at my doorstep in person, just as I was sipping my coffee. No hello, no how are you, just a stern look and the phrase, "We need to discuss your decor." I offered her a seat on my porch swing. She declined. Instead, she pointed to my garden, where a family of ceramic turtles peeked out from a bed of marigolds. "It's busy," she said, the way someone might describe a crime scene. "This isn't a carnival." I tried to keep things civil. I nodded. I said I understood the concern, even if I didn't quite see the issue. But when she began quoting obscure lines from the HOA bylaws, phrases like visual cohesion and aesthetic consistency, I knew we were speaking different languages. I spoke joy. She spoke regulation. Over the next week, I received 2 more notices. One cited my string lights, which apparently projected unregulated lumens. Another complained about a new addition, a smiling frog statue beside my mailbox. It was whimsical, sure, but it hardly warranted legal language. Create an emotionally neutral environment for passers-by, the notice said. What did that even mean? Was my yard supposed to evoke nothing? Were we going for a Zen garden of despair? The other neighbours started to take notice. Mrs. Petrov across the street gave me a conspiratorial thumbs up when I added a welcome mat that read, "This house runs on laughter." A teenager on a bike told me my yard was dope. Even old Mr. Jensen, who rarely spoke to anyone, muttered, "Looks better than all that HOA nonsense." Still, Karen's campaign continued, each letter growing more absurd. She was convinced, I realized, that my decorations were not just unsightly, but rebellious. Like I was staging a coup via gnome army and twinkly lights. That was the moment it became clear. This wasn't just about the flamingo or the frog or the pinwheels. It was about her needing to be in charge, and me refusing to bow. She wanted conformity. I wanted colour. And this was only the beginning. It was the 3rd Tuesday of the month when the envelope arrived, heavier than usual, as if burdened by the weight of its own ridiculousness. The HOA seal was stamped at the top, but this time, the letter wasn't just a notice. It was a formal summons to appear before the HOA board for a decorative misconduct review. I read the phrase 3 times, thinking surely I had misinterpreted it. But no. Karen had escalated. This wasn't passive-aggressive anymore. This was war. The letter outlined the many violations I had apparently committed, including emotionally suggestive garden art, distracting wind-based accessories, and my personal favorite, promotion of non-neutral emotional states through lawn ornamentation. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Had I unknowingly enrolled my yard in psychological warfare? Were the pinwheels planting seeds of rebellion in the minds of neighbours? According to Karen, yes. The decorations were disturbing the emotional equilibrium of the community. Her exact words. I showed up at the meeting out of pure curiosity, dressed in my brightest Hawaiian shirt just to set the tone. The room was silent when I entered, Karen already seated at the head of the table, like a judge preparing for sentencing. The rest of the board members looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Karen launched into her presentation with the flair of a prosecutor on a courtroom drama, complete with slideshow images of my yard from multiple angles. Each photo was dissected with commentary. "This gnome," she said, pointing with her laser pointer, "is smiling too aggressively. These wind spinners are too vibrant and attract unnecessary attention. And this flamingo," she paused, voice tight, "this flamingo is taunting me." There was an awkward cough from the corner of the room. Someone stifled a laugh. But Karen continued undeterred, listing aesthetic violations like they were criminal charges. I waited patiently for my turn to speak, and when it came, I kept it simple. "I like joy," I said, "and my yard makes people smile, including me." A few board members nodded subtly. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that the board was tired of the whole ordeal. They issued no fines, only a vague recommendation to exercise moderation in expressive landscaping. Karen was livid. Her face hardened into something unmovable, like the HOA rulebook had possessed her entirely. After the meeting, she cornered me in the parking lot. "You think this is funny?" she snapped. "This neighborhood has standards. This isn't Clown Town." And that was it, the final straw. Something inside me clicked, not in anger, but in amusement. If Karen believed my modest decorations had turned the block into Clown Town, then maybe it was time to give her an actual circus, not out of spite, but for the principle of it. If joy was a threat, then I'd give her the happiest, bounciest, most unapologetically festive threat she'd ever seen. It was time for a castle. A big, bright, inflatable one. The idea came to me while watching my niece's birthday party video. There it was, gleaming in the background like a monument to childhood rebellion. A towering, neon-colored bouncy castle, wobbling with laughter and pure, unfiltered joy. As I watched the kids leap and tumble inside, something clicked. If Karen thought a flamingo was too festive, what would she do when faced with an actual inflatable fortress of delight? It wasn't just about making a statement. It was about reclaiming the right to be happy on my own lawn. I started researching rental companies that specialized in party inflatables. Not just your average backyard bounce house. I wanted one with turrets, flags, and maybe even a slide. I found a local company with a castle-themed inflatable that looked like it had been ripped from the dreams of sugar-fueled children. Its colors were loud, unapologetic, electric blue, sunshine yellow, fire engine red. It was perfect. I called the owner, a cheerful man named Frank, and explained the situation. To my surprise, he didn't just understand, he offered me a discount. HOA trouble? He said knowingly. Say no more. I'll even throw in the balloon arch for free. But this wasn't just about the castle. I needed it to be an event. If I was going to stand up to Karen's tyranny of beige, I was going to do it with confetti and snow cones. I began planning a full-on neighborhood party. I sent out invitations to all the houses on our block, carefully excluding only one address, Karen's. The invites were bright yellow with a smiling sun and the words, "Bounce back bash, come celebrate color." Most people responded with curiosity, some with glee. A few even told me they'd been waiting for someone to finally push back. The days leading up to the party were electric. Kids rode past my house on scooters, trying to peek at what was coming. Neighbors dropped off folding chairs and coolers. Mrs. Petrov baked cookies shaped like gnomes. Even Mr. Jensen, the quietest man on the street, donated a stack of board games in case it rains. There was this quiet solidarity building, an unspoken agreement that maybe, just maybe, we'd let a little color back into our lives. Still, I was careful to play within the rules, technically. The HOA guidelines didn't prohibit temporary inflatables for private events. As long as the castle was taken down by sunset, I was clear. I read the fine print twice, printed it out, and even highlighted the relevant passages just in case Karen decided to go full courtroom drama on me. I wasn't just bringing a castle, I was bringing legal receipts. The night before the party, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing Karen's face when she saw it. The slow turn of her head, the narrowing of her eyes, the tight press of her lips. I could almost hear her voice, dripping with disbelief. "Is that a bouncy castle?" And I'd smile, wave, and say, "Why, yes, it is. Would you like to jump?" Of course she wouldn't. But that wasn't the point. The point was joy. The point was resistance, the inflatable kind. I wasn't staging a protest. I was hosting a celebration. And if she happened to be allergic to happiness, well, that was her problem to solve. The plan was set. The castle would arrive at 10 a.m. sharp, fully inflated by noon. Music, games, food, and color would follow. Karen had declared war on cheerfulness. It was time to show her exactly what she was up against. The sun rose like it had been waiting for this moment. Clear skies, not a cloud in sight, and a breeze just strong enough to flutter the corner of the Bounce Back Bash sign I'd tied to the mailbox. I stood on the porch, coffee in hand, heart pounding with a cocktail of excitement and mischief. At exactly 10:02 a.m., Frank's truck pulled up, trailer hitched, castle loaded, ready for glory. Frank hopped out wearing a t-shirt that read, "Inflate the fun," and I knew I'd chosen the right man for the job. Within minutes, the backyard was buzzing with motion. The castle was unfurled like a giant rainbow sleeping bag, and the whir of the blower filled the air with anticipation. It rose slowly at first, wobbling, sagging, then straightening with royal pride. By noon, the inflatable stood tall and magnificent, a monument to joy and rebellion in the middle of suburban regulation. Neighbors began arriving even before the food was ready. Kids were the first to dive into the bouncy castle, their squeals echoing down the block. Adults gathered around the grill, chatting and laughing, some for the first time since moving in. Someone brought a Bluetooth speaker, and soon music floated across the lawns. Nothing too loud, just enough to make it feel like summer. There were balloons tied to lawn chairs, lemonade flowing freely, and paper plates piled high with potluck generosity. Everyone was there, except the one person who mattered most. It wasn't long before Karen made her appearance. I noticed the curtain twitch in her front window around 12:45. At 1 o'clock sharp, she emerged. Hair immaculately styled, clipboard in hand, she walked briskly toward the commotion with the rigid determination of someone prepared to confront a fire and extinguish it with passive aggression. She stopped at the edge of my driveway, surveying the scene with horror and disbelief, as if I'd summoned a parade of clowns and circus animals. I greeted her with the friendliest wave I could muster. "Afternoon, Karen. Would you like a snow cone?" She didn't answer, her eyes locked on the bouncy castle, which now had a line of giggling children bouncing like popcorn. She turned slowly, stepping onto my lawn as though each blade of grass offended her deeply. The music lowered slightly. Someone had noticed her arrival, and the air became thick with tension. "This is unacceptable," she said finally, her voice taut with barely restrained fury. "You're violating multiple regulations. This inflatable monstrosity—" I calmly reached into the folder I'd placed on the garden table. "Actually, Karen, temporary inflatables are allowed for private gatherings, as long as they're removed before dusk and don't obstruct public walkways. HOA Guidelines, Article 6, Section 3. Highlighted for your convenience." She snatched the paper and scanned it furiously, her face shifting from rage to disbelief to something resembling pure existential crisis. Around us, laughter continued. Someone blew bubbles. A child in a superhero cape tumbled gleefully out of the castle and shouted, "This is the best day ever!" Karen's lips pressed into a line so tight it threatened to collapse in on itself. She didn't respond. She simply turned around, clipboard shaking slightly in her grip, and walked back home without another word. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Around me, the celebration went on uninterrupted. My yard, for once, wasn't just a patch of land between two driveways. It was alive. And for one perfect afternoon, it was everything Karen said it shouldn't be. Too loud, too colorful, too happy. Exactly as I intended. Karen didn't stay inside for long. About 20 minutes after her first retreat, she came storming back across the street, this time without her clipboard, which made the situation all the more ominous. Her hands were free now, clenched tightly at her sides like fists of justice. She marched directly up to the castle, eyes bulging, jaw set like concrete, as if sheer willpower could deflate the whole thing on command. Children bounced blissfully behind her, unaware that suburban warfare was brewing just beyond the inflatable walls. "Turn it off," she barked, voice trembling with rage. "Now!" I was halfway through a conversation with Mr. Jensen, who'd just confessed that he hadn't laughed this much since 1994. We both turned to look at her, blinking like she'd just shouted fire at a birthday party. I held up a paper plate with 3 deviled eggs and a cupcake on it and smiled. "You want a snack, Karen?" "I want this circus shut down," she snapped. "This is a residential neighborhood, not an amusement park." I gestured broadly to the lawn. "Actually, Karen, it's a private gathering on private property, attended by residents, within all HOA regulations. Nothing in violation, unless happiness itself is now forbidden." Her face turned the color of a bruised tomato. She looked around for support, but was met with silence. The neighbors she usually counted on to nod in agreement had become suspiciously engrossed in their plates, their conversations, their children's antics. Mrs. Petrov made a sudden and intense interest in refilling her lemonade. Even the board members who had once entertained her complaints kept their distance. Karen was alone on this battlefield. "You think this is funny?" she hissed. "You're mocking the integrity of this community." "I'm celebrating it," I replied, "with balloons." That was when she snapped. She let out a high-pitched, stuttering noise, half laugh, half scream, and then kicked over the lemonade table. Cups went flying, ice scattered across the grass like tiny hailstones. The snow cone machine gave a mournful wheeze as its plug slipped loose. Children paused. Adults froze. The entire yard fell into a stunned hush. Karen, panting, stood at the center of her own disaster. Her heel caught the edge of a sprinkler head, and she stumbled backward into a lawn chair, collapsing in a crumple of frustration and polyester slacks. A child giggled, then another. Laughter rippled outward like a wave until the whole yard was chuckling, not out of cruelty, but because the tension had broken like a balloon finally popped. Phones had come out by then. Cameras clicked. Someone was already uploading the scene to the neighborhood Facebook group. Karen scrambled up, face burning, and without another word, marched home again. This time, she didn't look back. An hour later, the HOA president stopped by. He grabbed a soda, complimented the bounce house, and told me quietly that perhaps the community could revisit certain aesthetic restrictions. As the sun dipped lower and the music played on, I realized Karen hadn't just lost an argument. She'd lost her grip on the neighborhood, and all it took was a little air and a lot of joy. In the days following the party, something shifted on our street. The change wasn't immediate, but it was unmistakable, like a fog lifting or a tight knot slowly coming undone. It started with a few polite nods turning into real conversations. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact at the mailbox now waved enthusiastically, sometimes even walking over to chat. Laughter, the kind that used to be reserved for behind closed doors, began spilling into the open air. Kids rode their bikes a little longer. People lingered on porches a little later. It was as if the bouncy castle had broken some invisible spell. Karen, for a while, vanished completely. Her shutters remained closed, her front yard as pristine and lifeless as ever. I half expected another letter, another summons, another attempt to reclaim her imaginary throne. But nothing came. The clipboard didn't make another appearance. Her name stopped popping up in the HOA meeting notes. Eventually, word spread. She had resigned from the board. No explanation, no farewell speech. Just a single line in the minutes. Karen Whitmore has chosen to step down from her position. No one threw a party to mark the occasion, but the silence she left behind felt oddly celebratory. Then came the ripple effect. A week after the castle event, Mrs. Petrov put a row of garden gnomes along her walkway, each wearing a different silly hat. A few houses down, someone installed a solar-powered bubble machine. Even Mr. Jensen added a bird feeder shaped like a mini diner, complete with a tiny neon open sign. These weren't revolutions, they were gentle declarations. Joy, it turned out, was contagious. At the next HOA meeting, the tone was completely different. The board discussed revising the aesthetic guidelines to include more flexibility for personal expression. No one mentioned Karen by name, but her presence hung like a ghost that had finally been exorcised. I didn't say much, just sat in the back and listened, quietly enjoying the fact that the room was filled with people who no longer looked afraid to smile. The best moment came a few evenings later. I was on my porch, sipping iced tea and watching the neighborhood wind down, when a little girl I didn't recognize walked past with her mom. She pointed at my yard and said, "That's the happy house." I smiled. Her mum gave me a nod. It was simple, but it meant everything. I hadn't set out to lead a movement. I just wanted to keep my flamingo. But somehow, in defending the right to be cheerful, to be colourful, to be a little silly, I'd reminded people that there was more to life than conformity, that sometimes it's okay to break the mould, to throw a party, to laugh a little too loudly. And so the neighbourhood moved forward, not perfect, but a little brighter. The castle was long gone, deflated and packed away, but its spirit lingered. My yard was still happy. And now, no one was afraid to say so. There's a certain kind of peace that comes from standing in your yard at sunset, the air still warm, the grass beneath your feet soft, and knowing that you didn't back down. My flamingo stands proudly in its usual spot, a little faded from the sun but still smiling. The wind spinner catches the evening breeze just right, sending a shimmer of colour dancing across the flower beds. The gnomes, now joined by a few new recruits gifted by neighbours, keep watch like whimsical sentinels. It's not just decoration anymore. It's a statement, a celebration, a quiet victory in a neighbourhood once strangled by sameness. What began as a simple battle over lawn ornaments turned into something far bigger than I imagined. It reminded everyone, myself included, that joy doesn't need permission. That happiness, when shared openly, has a way of softening edges and building bridges. I didn't win a war against the HOA or defeat Karen in some grand showdown. All I did was refuse to let someone else's grey worldview dictate my little corner of the world. I let colour in, and eventually, so did everyone else. Sometimes I still think about Karen, whether she sits at her window, watching the slow transformation of the street she once ruled. I don't know what she sees when she looks out now, but I hope maybe, just maybe, she's started to understand. That a smiling gnome isn't a threat, that a bouncy castle isn't an act of aggression, that a yard filled with life and colour isn't a rebellion. It's an invitation. These days I find myself enjoying the small things more. A neighbour's wind chime, a kid's chalk drawings on the sidewalk, an old man planting marigolds where hedges once stood. It's as if the whole neighbourhood has breathed out at last, no longer afraid to show a little personality. And at the centre of it all, my yard remains what it's always been, a place that makes people pause and smile. Maybe it's not the tidiest lawn or the most traditional, but it's the happiest. And honestly, that's all I ever wanted.